Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And this week, this is also the show where we are going to dig into the midterm elections that happened earlier this week. So I have to welcome regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser from Brattleboro and journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. And I have one quick technical question for Emilie before I dive in with my questions for John on the midterms. Emilie, so you are technically a rep, but you have technically been reelected and will be sworn in January. So are you representative-elect or are you still representative?
No, I'm still representative from my previous, I'm still the representative of Wyndham 2-1 until January 4th, at which point I will be the representative of Wyndham 7.
See, I'm glad I asked because as people will remember, we did some redistricting in Vermont earlier. And so instead of Brattleboro being one district with 3 little pockets in it, we now have, they each are their own numbered separate district. So yes, thank you. Now, John Walters.
What's your title?
the king of the Vermont Political Observer. I want to dive right in. My big burning question for you is, way back, if you throw your mind back into the Wayback Machine before the primaries in August, one thing you were really taking note of is how much turnover there was on the Vermont political scene. We had, namely with Senator Leahy retiring, we had that change. So we've had change in our congressional seats, yay! And we had a number of people retiring or stepping down, that type of thing. Now that all that has sugared off, what are you thinking of all the change? Was it as much as you expected? Did we see as much of upheaval as you thought we might?
Well, in one important way, it was way more than I expected, and that's the Democratic wave in the state house. Picking up 11 seats was not on anybody's radar. Driving the Republicans down to 38, a level they've never been at before. And you have to go back to the 100-year reign of the Republican Party to have any major party that low. Back in like the 50s.
Right.
So, that's going to be a huge change. And, my most recent post at the time of taping was about the fact that, if they so choose, the legislature could be extremely progressive and extremely confrontational with Governor Scott because they have a significant, veto overrides are never easy, but they're certainly going to be a lot easier than they were any time before. And if the legislature is so inclined, they could be throwing a whole bunch of bills at Governor Scott, daring him to veto them, and then overriding a bunch of them. So it could be a remarkably contentious session because, the governor can claim a mandate of his own and legislative leadership can claim their mandate. And I was interested in hearing what Emilie thought if the legislature is gearing up for that kind of a progressive confrontational approach.
Well, first, I feel very aware that the larger our majority is, the bigger our big tent becomes.
Right. Good point.
And we have a very large tent. I think a larger tent than even usual this year. And so I feel very aware of that. And how important it is going to be to have all of these different representatives getting their constituents' needs met. I also, if 2 groups of folks, 2 people, 2 bodies, on some level share equal level mandates, I think there's a lot to be argued about the governor's supposed mandate from his votes, but perhaps that does not lead to massive confrontation, but in fact, a greater willingness to just work together and figure stuff out and get it done, which has not been seen from this governor before. So maybe now that we actually, have this power, and he might be better able to recognize the power. I think previously he behaved quite dismissively towards what was a pretty large majority. And I think part of that, we can talk about his attitude towards the two female leaders of the chambers and how that might have played out.
The adult in the room,
Yeah.
which is a phrase he has used.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. There was certainly a lot of paternalism going on around there. So I wonder if maybe maybe it'll be a greater confrontation. Maybe it'll mean the governor will actually just show up at the table and be willing to have conversations about
and
getting stuff done for Vermonters. Because the one thing that, his platform didn't exist. And he seems very stuck on, business as usual and just continuing to strip state government of any capacity it has. And so maybe this would mean that he's willing to at least allow stuff to get done, if not get it done himself. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a possibility. If Phil Scott is who he claims to be, that's what he would do. He would work with people, and he would come to the table, and he would work stuff out with the legislative leadership. I'll be surprised if he does that, frankly. That hasn't been his MO until now. I think he's entering the final phase of his political career. Few governors serve more than 4 terms, and nobody serves more than 5. So he's at the back end, which could make him think twice about his legacy and how he wants to go out, or it could lead him to kind of double down on his being the bulwark against those irresponsible progressives in the legislature.
And I think a lot of that, I think those conversations with the very responsible progressives in the legislature, on some level, depend on who he surrounds himself with. I think that's true for anyone. And he's really at this point surrounding himself with the D team or F team or K team. I mean, I don't even know how far down the alphabet we need to go this many years into the administration. And, there are definitely some good people who have hung on, but there's some positions in the administration that have turned over so many times that they're really just grasping at straws to find someone.
And all he does is pick the next person up. Anytime somebody leaves, it's the person below them who just gets moved up a notch. And sooner or later, you dilute the quality that way. And so, that's one of the things that happens when a governor serves 3+ terms, is they tend to water down their quality.
Especially, I think,
interesting
governor who feels very comfortable with sort of white male privilege and is really has no qualms about letting other white men fail up, which is what I've seen numerous times. We've all seen numerous times in this administration.
And occasionally a white woman failing up.
Indeed.
So the other thing to factor in with this, whether it will be a contentious session or not, is that the federal COVID money is going away, and the next couple of years are going to be very tight budget-wise, and there are a lot of competing demands for resources, a lot of urgent needs. And so I would think that even if the legislature and the governor manage to work together on policy issues, he routinely vetoes budgets, and it's going to get even harder. It's going to be harder than ever, I think, the next 2 years.
And I always find, and I don't know if I can't remember if this came from Scott himself or if this came from other folks, but this idea of Scott as a great manager of the state, I find that moniker so interesting, because some of the contention that you were both talking about, to me, is not a sign of good management. Do you know what I mean? So there's so many ways that I feel, I don't know, I guess maybe like our definition of affordability seems to be very different. Maybe our definition of management tends to be different as well. But it doesn't feel like he's managing well when it comes to not talking to the legislature or vetoing things at the last minute, that kind of thing.
No, and we could call that politics and politics schmolitics and all of that. And like, I think the definition of a good manager means that the folks working for you have purpose and direction and aren't just like hemorrhaging from misery and dissatisfaction and lashing out at everyone around them. And state employees right now are across the administration so desperate and sad. And I don't like, it becomes a very, and like, I don't know if this is the conversation for today. I think this might be a much longer conversation, but it becomes very difficult. And this is something that Mary Hooper and I actually talk about a lot in the context of Joint Fiscal Committee, the outgoing chair of the Appropriations Committee, that it's very hard to move forward with what we see as like meaningful legislative change and good government when we know that in doing that, we are asking folks who have no capacity whatsoever to change what they're doing in even small ways, even improving what they're doing. The folks working in state government right now have absolutely no capacity to do that. And because they've been refusing staffing for a decade. And being like, managed by political winds, it's really desolate, and it scares me more. It scares me in the same way the deeply undemocratic election denier conversations scare me, because it's really like a stripping away of why we organize ourselves.
He plays a good manager on TV. The thought struck me earlier this week that Phil Scott is Vermont's Ronald Reagan. Not as conservative as Reagan, not quite, but he does the same thing. He plays the strong, competent leader on TV. He deeply believes in and reflects back on Vermonters their most cherished myths about themselves. And people feel really good about that. And that's hard to overcome. That's brilliant politics. It's not brilliant management, but it's why he's got 3/4 of the vote the last couple of times.
So I want to talk about these amazing House races, because this is
yes.
Sorry,
We're talking about the election, right?
We are talking about the election. Let's talk about the election. Let's talk about like this amazing House sweep, and even some surprises in the Senate. Yeah.
So where would you like to start, Emilie? What was the bright spot for you in this election?
So I mean, the bright spot is how many House members won elections. And I have a hot take on it that I want to throw out for people to think about.
Okay.
So I do think that some of this was that like people really did sort of reject the extremist side of the Republican Party at the polls. I do think that's part of it. And John, you did an exemplary job of journalism on revealing some of those. And I think that the number of emerged folks running is particularly interesting, not just because it means that like well-trained women are entering politics, which is great, and more women and more parents, like more mothers are entering politics. I think that's also great. I think part of it is that it's more and more folks entering the political arena who don't feel like they have a natural right to those seats. And what that
Hmm.
means, and if they felt like they had a natural right to those seats, they probably wouldn't enroll in Emerge because they wouldn't feel like they needed training in order to do this
Right.
well. And what that means is you had a bunch of folks in these elections who were hustling hard because they felt like that was what they needed to do to win.
Hmm.
And so we had folks in this race, and who raised the bar across the election, outside of Emerge candidates to say, like, you need to knock on every door. You need to make sure voters know who you are. You need to be fully prepared for debates. You need to send out comprehensive talking points. You need to have a platform and a website and like show up and tell people what you stand for and who you are and what your core values are. And that was because it was folks who didn't feel like they just deserved it. So they were like out there really fighting for it. And I think that's part of why the Democrats had such a solid win.
Yeah.
Interesting. What do you think, John?
Well, Emerge is a force. It trains women to run or to run campaigns. And it does something that is the most difficult thing for any party to do, which is recruit candidates. And Emerge provides an available pool of people who are equipped to run and eager to run. And that makes the job of the state party so much easier. And the Republicans suffered greatly from not having an equivalent of Emerge. So it's an incredibly important thing for the state of our government.
And, based on what Emilie just said, John, when you were listening in on debates and when you were covering the run up to the election, did you notice a change in the quality of debates or the quality or even just what was coming forward as talking points? Like how did you see that play out from your side of the spectrum?
Well, to be honest, when I watched debates, I was mostly watching the crazy Republicans. For my series on stealth conservatives that showed exactly how many Republicans were running for office who had very extreme views and tried to hide them behind
Mm.
a wall of sort of standard conservative rhetoric about taxes and regulation and that sort of thing.
And
But
can I just jump in there for a minute, John? I'm sorry to derail your train of thought, but if you have political views that you feel you need to hide from the general public, shouldn't that clue you in to maybe you're not like serving your constituents and meeting them where they're at, and maybe you need to rethink some of your perspective? Just throwing that out there. Okay.
Very good point, Olga.
yeah, well, exactly. And I never thought that this series would go on as long as it did. And in truth, I never got like halfway as far as I could have. There were so many candidates I never got to. Like down in your neck of the woods, Nancy Gassett, who ran against Sarah Coffey.
Mhm.
I did get to John Liddy and Eva Ryan and Lynn Carrault, but there are always more. By my count, 58 of the, 90 something Republican candidates were, actually it was 100 total, were extremists. And that doesn't include the people I didn't actually get to dive into. So I'm sure the actual number was probably somewhere in the range of 65 to 70. And that's amazing. This isn't like extremists occupying a little part of the Republican Party. This is the extremists are the Republican Party.
Mhm. And
What that bodes for the future of the party is nothing but bad, because these candidates lost all over the place.
Sorry, Emilie, I just want to jump in quickly, because I think, in the past few years, we've started throwing around like the word extremist a lot. I worry that for some of our listeners, maybe it's lost meaning. So for you, John, how were you defining that?
Well, I actually did define it in one of my posts, and I'm going to try to remember it now. There were a number of policy positions, denying that COVID is really that serious,
Mhm.
being against vaccines or against mandated vaccines, which bled over into the anti-vax thing more generally. uh, being upset about critical race theory or drag queen story hour or Black Lives Matter, questioning the 2020 election. There were a few others on the list, but that's a good starting point. And
Mhm.
these candidates that I profiled all espoused some or all of those views. And that's
you.
how I defined extremist from my point of view, and people who qualified for the series. There were a few Republican candidates I looked at who I decided really didn't quite fit the bill.
Mhm.
But for the most part, they were out there, and if they had a benign campaign webpage, the crazy seeped out either in candidate debates or on their past social media, which was still there.
Mhm.
So they couldn't hide it, and the truth is that they were far too conservative for the electorate. I profiled 24 of these people, and 23 of them lost.
Mhm.
Now
Thank you, John.
the
And I
one the one who won could be one of the most dangerous ones of all, because the guy, Jared Samus is his name. He's from Castleton, I think. And, he had a bunch of YouTube videos that were all about guns. Some of them were talking about violence against, people on the other side. And when that became public knowledge, he closed down his YouTube page.
Mhm.
And he's now a member of the House, and he might be joining a committee that Emilie is sitting on. Although he's probably going to wind up on one of the less crucial committees. I'm sure, agriculture or something like that.
Well, and we just don't usually, Ways and Means doesn't usually have brand new members on it. Usually people enter it in their second biennium. So
Yeah.
I do have hopes for the sort of larger legislative culture's ability to temper people's extremist behavior, just because no one really pays attention to ranting in any political direction in that building. It was a really interesting balancing act that I saw from some of my colleagues, that, Vermonters are so reactive to negative campaigning.
Mhm.
And I think in a lot of ways that's fantastic, but it makes it really hard for a candidate to reveal the sometimes terrifying views of another candidate. And so I saw Kathleen James actually in Manchester do an incredibly good job being like very gracious, very neutral, and just making sure, like, not even speaking with judgment particularly, just being very sure to make sure that her constituents understood the views of this person she was running against. And I think Catherine Sims did that as well. But it's very, very hard to do in a way that Vermonters don't react to.
Mm,
Yeah,
good
my
point.
favorite debate moment, and I watched a lot of debates doing this. My favorite debate moment of the entire cycle was Kathleen James near the end of a forum with her seatmate Seth Bongartz and their extremist Republican opponent Joe Gervais. She just ruthlessly, very calmly and politely, but without pity, just nailed him to the wall on his extremist views on the 2020 election specifically. And Gervais just was squirming in his seat while she was just taking him apart in very plain language. It's the kind of thing, these people, when they get out of their bubble, they really don't know how to talk.
Mhm.
So used to their own little world. It's troubling. It's fun to gloat over the fact that they pretty much all of them lost, but it's troubling that this is where the Republican Party, it's not where the party is going, it's where the party is.
Yes.
Right.
It is not a serious, counterbalance to the Democrats. And, two-party system works better when both of the parties are at least sane.
Yeah.
If a party went nuts in a parliamentary system, that wouldn't matter so much. But in the two-party system, the Republicans just are not competitive anymore, and their leadership at the local and county level is also, full of extremists. And I seriously doubt they're going to learn anything from this year.
Yeah.
They're going to press forward with what they think is right, and they're going to be increasingly irrelevant.
I also worry that my colleagues in the House who are more moderate Republicans, who really do care about everyone in their community and want what's best for them, though they have certainly a very different view of how to get there than I do, how they'll feel compelled to perform differently, to speak differently, that how they'll change from the pressure that they feel from within their party or from within their constituents, their core constituency. And, we see Scott do that sometimes. Like, he definitely sort of throws red meat, but he also has sort of the political power at this point to, he had a separate election night party. And when asked about it, he said that some of his cabinet wouldn't have been comfortable at the Republican Party, which is fascinating and strange. Yeah. Also, I just want to make sure that all of our listeners, if you are on Twitter, Peter Hirschfeld was at the Republican election night party and did a little film reel of the DJ music and the absolute lack of dancing. That was one of the funnier things I've seen this election season, and I highly recommend watching it.
Well, thank you, Emilie. On that note, we need to head to break so we can hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So stay tuned. We will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with Representative Emilie Kornheiser and journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. We've been wrapping up the midterm elections. And before we dive back in to some of the results, Emilie, what do we need to remind people of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station or their employers nor friends.
Thank you. So for you, Emilie, who will be returning to the State House in January, what has this midterm election meant for you? Because you will have a whole bunch of new colleagues come January.
So many new colleagues. I will have some very good colleagues who have been in the House previously going over to the Senate, who I have really solid connections and relationships with. There will be all these new folks, and there's also going to be a lot of new folks in leadership. And so for me, I feel like from the chaos and change, like so much opportunity will be born. I feel so optimistic and excited about the potential in front of us. I felt that way before we wound up with the sort of scale of majority that we have now, and I feel even more solid in that. These are times that we really, I'm going to quote Becca Balance congressional acceptance speech or whatever happened on election night, whatever we call that speech. These are really like times for courage. And I think within all this change, within all this new opportunity, like we can really come in and feel very solid in what is possible for our communities.
How about you, John?
Well,
what do you think about some of the change in leadership that could be happening?
Well, the place where the change will be, I think, potentially seismic is the state Senate. Phil Baruth apparently is going to be the next pro tem, replacing Becca Ballant. Hard act to follow. The numbers didn't change significantly in the Senate, but a bunch of new people are going there who will make a difference. Nader Hashim, Becca White from Windsor County, Ann Watson from Washington County, who is very young and very progressive, and I'm sure she's an Emerge alum, although I don't know that for a fact. Tanya Vyhovsky from Chittenden County, Martine Gulick from Chittenden County. I just named 5 people.
Wendy Harrison from Windham County. We got 2
right.
really great folk.
Yeah, we did.
But 5 or 6 people in a body of 30 is a significant number. And it adds to a gradual turnover we have seen in the last 2 or 3 cycles where, the old lions of the Senate are retiring and younger people are taking their place. And this may be the year when it hits critical mass. And the average age of committee chair in the Senate this past biennium was over 70.
Mhm.
And that's not going to be the case anymore. There are going to be more and more people who really want to, push policy in a progressive direction, a small p progressive. Um, and some of those people are going to move into leadership. Keisha Ram Hinsdale may be a committee chair. She talked about wanting to be chair of economic development, which would be a
Hmm.
huge change in approach.
Mhm.
All
My
those,
understanding is that she's been promised chair of economic development.
well,
Oh.
as far as I'm concerned, that would be a really good move. She would. Mike Sirotkin was a solid Democrat, but he was not terribly imaginative on economic development issues, and his committee didn't really do a lot of work in any sort of progressive direction. And if Keisha's running the roost, then that's going to change big time.
And excitingly, very small policy detail, very exciting. Michael Sirotkin was the person who was most committed to the scheme to pay people to move to Vermont.
Oh,
And
yes.
with him gone, we can finally release ourselves from the burden of that absurd policy and waste of money.
Woohoo!
Big
And-
hopes for the new biennium, folks.
And the economic incentive, business incentives in general,
Yes.
Mhm.
I would think would get a fresh look, because those programs, generally, they're very popular, especially among centrist Democrats and Republicans. Phil Scott loves them.
But they don't work or do anything.
There's no proof that they
No.
work.
Yeah.
And that's built into the programs themselves. Supposedly in order to get an incentive, the business has to show that this expansion or this improvement would not happen without the state money. But they don't have to provide any evidence. They just have to say that, it's going to do this or that, and nobody checks up on them afterward. So that would be a nice thing, a small thing, but a nice thing. And the other side of this is, what is the progressive vision of economic development?
Mhm.
Mhm.
And that's something we're going to see, I think, in the next legislature.
Senator Ruth Hardy might also have a committee chair.
Yeah, she's one of the more senior members at this point.
Mhm.
And that's part of what's going on is those people who were elected 4, 6, 8 years ago are now, ready for positions of leadership.
Mhm.
And I have to think that sooner or later, the rest of the old guard is going to either be willing to step back into the shadows a little bit, excuse me, or they'll retire altogether in 2 years. I have heard some talk that there might actually be a change in Senate transportation, which is Dick Mazza's roost.
Mm.
I've heard that Andy Perchlik of Washington County, who is very progressive on climate issues, he's been on the transportation committee. I have heard that he would like to be chair. He kind of stepped aside in the race for pro tem to let Phil Baruth take it. So there may be something going on there. It would have to be with Mazza's approval, but maybe he's ready to relax a little bit. I don't know. But that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. They're just, whether or not the committee chairs, turn over radically, there's just going to be a lot of fresher, younger, newer faces in the Senate, and that's going to be a big change, even though the partisan split is still the same.
Mhm. One thing, just being very personal to Windham County, I'm excited about Nodder and Wendy because I love their combination of the experience they're bringing to the Senate. Nodder having served in the House before, and then Wendy having worked at the municipal level for so long. I'm just excited to see what they bring to the Senate as a team.
I saw Nodder in his one term in the House, and he was remarkably effective for a first term representative. And I'm really looking forward to him being back in Montpelier and being a state senator now.
I also think that there are a lot of introverts in the House, but it is a hard place to be an introvert because you really do need to track 150 people,
Mm,
and that's tiring.
mhm.
And so I think the more intimate setting of the Senate, he will thrive even further there.
Yeah.
You
Mhm.
know, there are going to be so many more active parents in the Senate.
Yes.
That will be a big culture shift. I think there was a while where Ruth and Becca were really the only ones.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so that's going to be really incredible and such a change. I also, with so many House members, former House members being in the Senate, that really helps House Senate relations.
Yes.
Mm,
Um, it's really a big difference. And then, this is like super technical, but when Jill Kerwinsky and Becca Ballant were serving together as pro tem and majority leader, they did a tremendous amount of work with their chief of staff to change the HR structure of legislative staffing.
hmm.
And staff are much, much happier than they were a few years ago. And that is going to also pay off in our ability to get our work done.
Mhm.
Yeah. The staff are invisible, but they are extremely important. And there are so few of them
Mhm.
that if the ones who are there are happy and are good at their jobs, that makes a huge difference. I
Mhm.
mean, each committee has one staffer. The Speaker of the House has one staffer. So that person had better be good.
Um, Emilie, just let us know what were some of the HR changes that were made. I know it's technical, but I think it's pretty significant.
So there's sort of a director for every department, but they now have director meetings
Mhm.
where they all meet across, their different divisions. So like, the head of legislative council and the head of the joint fiscal office and all of those folks, they all meet weekly. This is like, I'm talking like basic management stuff, people.
Oh, yeah.
And then we have an HR director now. All HR issues previously would like often go through the pro tem or the speaker's office,
Mm.
who did not have time or capacity or expertise to do that. And so there's now an HR office who can take care of a lot of those issues and has put in place pay scales and like we're talking bare bones basics of management
Mhm.
changes, but they are significant and meaningful.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because what I
Yeah.
find so fascinating and continues to fascinate me with Vermont politics is I know we have this story and a tradition of volunteer politics and volunteer municipal politics even. And yet our world has become complicated enough that I think we do need some professionalization of a lot of our systems and our levels of government. And I just find it so interesting how that is playing out in the state house.
It's really, part of it is that, no one there has a boss beyond their constituents.
Mhm.
And so when someone behaves inappropriately or unkindly or to staff, it's really hard to have consequences for that.
Mhm.
And so everything is by persuasion, which is a really challenging environment to operate in. And like has a lot of potential for like sort of co-op models of governance, like there's pros and cons there.
Mhm.
Um, and then we also all come, because we are a citizen legislature, with very different skills to the table. So there are folks who show up in that building and have like barely used a computer before in their lives. Like still even now, that's true. And I'm not just talking about older folks,
Mhm.
but folks who's sort of like career, because, there are people in their late 70s right now who have been using computers their entire life. My father
Right.
is one of them, like computers have been around a long time now, people. But there are folks who are carpenters or massage therapists who like just don't use computers as a regular everyday
Mhm.
part of their life necessarily. And so that's like, office stuff and navigating reply all versus not reply, like all of that like business culture stuff. That's a big growing and learning curve. And so it's and then sort of, the lack of insurance, all of those things. That's its own journey that we're not going to get into today. But it really takes a lot to bring on new members, and we are getting much better at it. But it's a big lift because it's not just learning how government works or how our particular corner of the legislature works or how totally implicit, never made explicit norms work. It's also just like, how do you navigate this particular workplace with its particular skill set? And, that's a lot to teach someone in a week.
Yeah. Yep. So, John, what are your hopes for the legislature and the Senate as we enter the new biennium?
I think my hope, we talked in the first half hour about whether there will be, confrontation or cooperation between, the governor and the legislature. I'm not optimistic on that front. That would require a big change in the governor. I think I'm hoping not that the legislature will fire off all the bills and, flood Governor Scott's desk with bills he doesn't want to sign. But I would hope that they feel empowered to take significant action on a number of priorities, top priorities: climate change, family leave, minimum wage, something more to do with the housing crisis. And I'm sure Emilie could tick off a couple more issues or a bunch more. But, if they put forward 5 solid bills that they could then, if Governor Scott vetoes them, that they could override, a really good climate plan, then that would be a very positive development. And I think that's doable.
How about you, Emilie?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we have an opportunity to not sort of pre-compromise, to really follow through on what we think would make meaningful change for Vermonters. And I'm hoping that we can, in sort of that greater context that we have of opportunity this next year, really look at how we can sort of bundle bills to tell a meaningful story to Vermonters about what government can do for them and can do with them. And so, when I think about family leave, I also think about, childcare and school lunches and how all of those pieces fit together, to make sure Vermonters are getting their core needs met as families. And so when I think about housing, I want housing to be a conversation around, building housing and taxes and zoning and climate, all together. And that feels like maybe we'll have the runway to be able to tell those stories better.
For both of you, 2 years ago, we were talking a lot about COVID and, how it was highlighting the cracks in the system and how that could actually be an opportunity. And then came the COVID funding, which was a bit of a windfall. And so we were talking about the opportunity here. And now that funding is going away. We have gone from pandemic to kind of endemic with some of our planning around COVID. But now we have a windfall of new people. And so we're kind of talking about opportunity there as well. Are either of you seeing any common threads or the last 2 years building on itself to where we are now? Because this midterm is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening after many years of for a lot of people, which has been a lot of upheaval and also opportunity. How are you seeing this midterm in that context?
I think people want solidity and stability very badly. And I think they want sort of policies that will create that. And so for me, that's all of those social infrastructure and physical infrastructure things I've been talking about. I don't want to sort of repeat myself, something I already said to Pete Hirschfeld at VPR, but I'm going to. So sorry for like the second round over here on the happy hour. Usually, I like you to get my fresh ideas. But I think that after seeing the scale of federal spending and the scale of state spending that was possible, I think people take longer to blink now at large numbers. And historically, there was a time in Vermont history where we closed the gap between our need to spend and our revenue by increasing revenue. And there have been many, many years in Vermont history where we have instead brought the ask down, not from what's needed, but just sort of spent what was available. And I think we can sort of maybe begin to have conversations about what it would look like to sort of close the alligator's mouth, as they call it, in a different way. I don't think that's all going to happen in 1 year, but I think sort of the need for stability, the opportunities that we've seen in federal and state spending provide a better opportunity to start having that conversation this year than we've had in a long time.
And, by stability, put words in your mouth. By stability, you don't mean stasis. You mean creating a system where more people don't feel anxious about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month or when they get sick. It's reducing that economic anxiety. And, if you make smart investments in the social safety net, in things like housing and, opiate treatment and mental health, then you have, in general, a more productive society. And that's the thing that people don't get and isn't explained often enough, is that a lot of these investments in people, actually pay off and generate more revenue and more activity and more happiness too, if you're into that.
Really almost immediately. And they also reduce long-term costs. No, I'm absolutely, when I say stability, I mean a stable floor for people to stand on so they're not shaking all the time and falling through the cracks and into the nets. I mean a stable floor that people can actually build lives on and invest in community and invest in business and invest in their own lives.
Yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if people no longer needed our emergency safety nets?
Or if they could really be emergency safety nets,
right?
Instead of like, the place where tens of thousands of Vermonters fall into, all the time. That's
an absolute crisis. Yeah,
that's a sad definition of emergency that takes in far too many people.
Definitely. Well, thank you, both of you. So just doing a time check. Personally, I'm feeling very excited about the new legislative term. I really can't wait to see what develops and what happens over the next few months. We have about 5 minutes left in the show, and we've pulled on, as always, we pull on a lot of threads. What do we want Emilie listeners to take away from the conversation today?
Continues to remain my least favorite question. Just like not a summarizer. Like, how far along in my career will I get before I'm like, I can do like the concise summary? I want folks to take away that, like, things might be very nerve-wracking on this federal level. We still don't know what will happen. But Vermont has, like, once again shown up to say that, like, we care about people's bodily autonomy. We have not even spent a moment celebrating the, like, sweep that we had on the Reproductive Liberty Amendment. That we want to be represented by folks who are reasonable and care deeply about their communities and are showing up to communicate about what's going on. And that in a time of great change, which we've experienced over the last, I don't even know how many years we've been experiencing rapid change, but we can really show up and build from that change. And I think
we should also celebrate the other constitutional amendments.
Yes. And I learned, I think Olga's frozen, but as we passed our amendment to take slavery from the Constitution, there were ballot measures on a bunch of
Zoom
other
has.
states to do the same. And when we, Louisiana actually didn't pass theirs.
Mm.
And that's just heartbreaking to me.
And I'm sorry, Emilie, I'm going to have you repeat that because at least on my end, Zoom froze.
Yes.
So you were talking about what other states have done. If you could just
so there
wrap
were
that up again.
ballot measures in a number of other states to remove language related to slavery from their constitutions. And while we passed ours, and that's incredible, I believe it was Louisiana where that ballot measure failed. And that is just heartbreaking to me.
Thank you.
Yeah. If we're talking about other states, my home state of Michigan had just an incredible election night. Re-electing the women in the statewide offices against election denier opponents, hard right people. They passed their own reproductive rights measure handily, not as overwhelmingly as Vermont. And they also flipped the state house and the state senate. Michigan was operating for the first time under a nonpartisan redistricting commission. And so they drew fair districts and competitive districts. And it turns out that when you draw things fairly, then the Democrats have a much better shot at winning in states like Michigan. And so they flipped the House and the Senate, and they won the majority of the congressional seats from Michigan. So, I couldn't be happier to be a Michigander. And that's outside the scope of this. It feels pretty darn good to be a Vermonter right now, too.
And what do you hope people will take away from our conversation today, John?
I think they should feel very good about the state and about the possibilities for what's to come in the near future. And that means the state government, whether you like Phil Scott or not, we do have a dynamic progressive legislature that's ready to go to work. We have a new member of Congress from Brattleboro who is just a dynamo. And she's going to, it's hard to make a difference if you're one of 435, but if anybody can, she can. Speaking of Becca Ballant, for anybody who is wondering who I'm talking about.
You've always been under a rock and is somehow still watching the show.
Yes. So it was just, unless you're a hardcore Republican, it was just a really, really good election night, and it sets the stage for good things to come.
Well, thank you. This is all the time we have in this week's show, unfortunately, but John, it's always a pleasure to have you join us and talk politics. If folks want to read more of your work, where can they find it?
The blog is called the Vermont Political Observer. The web address is thevpo.org. But, if you Google Vermont Political Observer, you will find me.
Thank you. Emilie, if folks want to find you.
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org and you can find links to all my social media accounts and my email. Has not been updated all that recently. So please sign up for my newsletter, which you can do when you first land on the website.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour airs on Friday at 2 p.m. on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, as well as BCTV. We thank BCTV for all the work they do, putting us out on the state's PEG stations. And at our webpage, the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm. And you can subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next week, folks, have a great weekend.